distance conjecture.
Okay, can you see the screen?
Mm-hmm.
Good. Okay, thank you very much, Fernando, and thank you all the organizers for the invitation to give a talk in this workshop. I am enjoying a lot the diversity and selection of the talks and learning a lot with some of them. So I hope that you can also learn and enjoy my talk, which I will try to make accessible for a wide audience. So please, if you have any question, I'm fine if you just interrupt me at any point, or if you prefer, just ask at the end. Okay, so my work is based, well, my talk is going to be based on this recent work with Jose Calderón Infante and Ángel Uranga, as well as previous work with fantastic collaborators like Stefano Lanza, Fernando Marchesano, and Luca Martucci. So let me start. Okay, so for those of you who are not very familiar with the Swampland program, let me just review that the word Swampland is used to describe those apparently consistent anomaly-free quantum effective field theories that cannot be UV embedded in quantum gravity. So in particular, they cannot arise from string theory. And this word is chosen in opposition to the landscape, which consists of those theories which can arise from string theory and are consistent with quantum gravity. So with the Swampland program, all we are doing is just taking seriously and analyzing in detail the fact that even if the landscape is huge, as probably you have heard, it's not everything. And that not everything is possible in string theory quantum gravity. That in the end, I mean, to get a unitary quantum gravity theory is not so easy. And that has constraints and has implications. And what we are trying is try to understand those implications, I mean, these constraints at low energies. So the goal of the Swampland program is just try to understand in detail what are the constraints that an effective field theory has to satisfy to be consistent with quantum gravity. So try to formulate these consistency criteria as some statements that we can give to someone working with effective field theories, and that person can check whether that theory is consistent or not. So what distinguishes the landscape from the Swampland? Now, I think, at least in my opinion, that the existence of the Swampland is great news for phenomenology, because it means that quantum gravity matters. I mean, if there is a Swampland, if not everything is possible, it means that there is a UV imprint of quantum gravity at low energies. And that can have implications. And whenever we have predictions and constraints, I think as physicists, we are happy about it, no? Because then we can check things. So one of the important goals is try to understand what are the phenomenological implications of these Swampland conjectures, these Swampland constraints. Hopefully with the idea that they can serve as guiding principles to construct beyond standard models, or as new insights to solve naturalness issues in our universe due to the UV IR mixing that provides, that quantum gravity provides. Now, this is a very ambitious goal, of course. And precisely because it's so ambitious, all we have at the moment are proposals for these constraints. So these proposals go under the name of Swampland conjectures because none of them has been proven in complete generality. Although, to be fair, I think in the past few years, we have increased and gathered a lot of evidence for some of them. So in certain setups and certain corners, some of them are not really conjectures anymore, while others are still at a very low level of evidence, and we have to improve that. So the goal is try to gather evidence to prove or disprove these conjectures and understand better what it means. And one of the most, one of the things in which we have made a lot of progress is understanding also the relations between these conjectures, which I think is very exciting because it hints that they are not different phases, but they might be, like different statements, but they might be different phases of the same underlying quantum gravity principles that we are starting to discover now. Okay, so of course, for the sake of time, I don't have time to explain all the Swampland conjectures. So in this talk, I'm just going to focus on one of them, which is the distance conjecture, and try to explain what is the state of the art, what are the implications and the most pressing questions for cosmology, and well, what we can do with it. Okay, so this is the outline. So I'm going to review the distance conjecture, and I'm going to focus on two questions which I think are important for cosmology. One is what happens with the distance conjecture when we are studying non-geodesic trajectories in the presence of a potential, because as you will see, the original formulation is only for geodesics. And second, try to be precise about what are the values of some of order 1 factors that typically appear in these conjectures, which is essential to ever give any phenomenological implication. Okay, so the distance conjecture appeared in already many years ago in this paper by Hirose and Kumrum, and basically says that an effective field theory cannot be valid for an infinite scalar field variation, because at some point, when the field variation becomes very large, there will be an infinite tower of states which become exponentially light in terms of this field distance. So for example, if you consider the model space of some effective field theory, so we have our scalar fields and they parameterize some scalar manifold, in which the metric of the scalar manifold is given by the field metric of the kinetic term. We can consider different effective field theories valid at different points of this modular space. So if we think of a theory valid at a point Q, and now we move towards an infinite distance boundary of this modular space, the conjecture says that at a point P, there should be, the effective field theory here should differ from the previous one by the existence of an infinite tower of states that decay exponentially, the mass decay exponentially with the geodesic distance between the 2 points. Okay, the presence of the tower implies a drastic breakdown of the effective field theory, because we are not just talking about a few new states, we are talking about an infinite tower, so we cannot keep a weakly coupled Einstein gravity description anymore. And this implies that the quantum gravity cutoff, the scale at which quantum gravitational effects become important, decreases exponentially with the distance. Okay, so in the past few years, I think, well, we have been working a lot trying to gather more evidence for this conjecture in non-trivial setups in which we have many different types of limits. And most of the progress have been done with extended supersymmetry, so having 8 supercharges, in which, in the context, for example, of Calabi-Yau compactifications, we have even been able to prove the conjecture using some theorems of algebraic geometry. So this is not a talk about string theory, so I'm not going to enter into the string theory evidence. All I wanted to show you is where the progress have been made, and remark that one of the outcomes is that motivated by this conjecture, we are actually uncovering some relations between these Swampland conjectures and some theorems of algebraic geometry and modular forms, which is helping us to understand better what is the asymptotic geometry of Calabi-Yau manifolds and other string compactifications. In particular, for example, we can give precise bounds about what is the exponential rate in these compactifications and so on. So the goal of my talk, since this is a workshop about cosmology, is try to understand better what are the implications for phenomenology. So the most obvious one that people usually say is that, well, since the cutoff decays exponentially with the distance, this implies an upper bound on the scalar field range that an effective field theory can describe. Now, this upper bound is not a sharp bound. It's not like 1 en Planck or 2 en Planck. It's a relation between the field range and the cutoff of the theory. So the larger the cutoff, the smaller the field range we can accommodate. And that's why if the cutoff gets closer to the Planck mass, then the field range gets closer, the upper bound gets closer to the Transplanckian field range. more detail, I mean, we could at least impose that the Hubble scale, for example, during inflation, has to be smaller than the cutoff. And this implies a relation between the field range and the Hubble scale, which can be written as a relation with the tensor to scalar ratio that goes in the opposite direction than the least bound. So this implies that if you want to consider slow roll inflation, there is a finite region that is allowed by the distance conjecture. Of course, exactly what region depends on the numerical, the exponential rate of the tower, this alpha here, okay? And this implies that since for some models, a few M Planck is enough to have inflation, then large field inflation is not ruled out, but it's constrained. Okay, so usually life is not white or black, it's something in between. So I think the conclusion of this is that one has to understand very well what are these values exactly of these alphas, these exponential rates, in order to understand in a precise way what models are constrained, what models are allowed, and what models are not. So for example, chaotic inflation would be outside of this region for a order 1 factor. And something that I don't think has been studied enough is also what are the cosmological signatures of this tower. I mean, we have an infinite tower not very far away. Here I am very conservative. I'm just imposing that the cutoff is bigger than Hubble, but I'm sure that there are many more implications of having this tower than just cutting the field range. That we could
Irene, can I ask a question?
Yes,
you invited
please.
them in the middle. So as you know, as we've discussed in some detail, some of these specific examples of the stringy versions of chaotic inflation, which have a large field flattened oscillator, with potential with underlying oscillations, those potentials include specific examples. I'm referring to this Powers of Monodromy paper, in which, I mean, in all the papers, this aspect of what else is happening as you go along the field range was studied very carefully. And in particular, what light degrees of freedom might appear and what do we know about those. And let's say in the ones that you and I most discussed recently, the answer is over the order 10 Planck units that are involved, there are some KK modes that become slightly lighter, but by a whopping factor of 10 to the 1/6, so not much at all. And so I think it's crucial to, when you're reviewing this, to stress that not only is it not ruled out, but there are examples where it's, and the original examples of this, in which people studied that and found it to be quite consistent and not particularly phenomenologically impactful.
Yeah,
aside from the B mode signature itself.
Here I have something different in mind. I'm just saying that typically, I don't know, when we talk about this conjecture, we are just trying to give some bound on the tensor to scalar ratio or something like this on the field range. But I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I think that the fact that we have an infinite tower of states, I mean, depending how the states are interacting and everything, they could also have some cosmological signatures in non-Gaussianities or other things. And I don't know, I think maybe before detecting the tensor to scalar ratio, I mean, what we can get sensitive to the infinite tower because of all these other signatures. And there are some models in which it has a study, of course, but I don't think it has a study in general, taking into account the properties that the distance conjecture tells you that this tower needs to have.
Well, that's
something interesting for the future. I mean, I would like to understand better if there are some cosmological signatures. For example, I will explain that I think this is related to restoring some global symmetry. Sometimes it's related to having some axionic symmetry and how small is this decay constant, and maybe having also charge strings under this axion. So we could have also cosmic strings and many other things that, I mean, I think.
Well, certainly the existence of the KK tower is very interesting. And in fact, that kind of thing is why the potential gets flattened out in the first place, is that those fields adjust, and that's incorporated in the 0th order solution. So it's certainly interesting to take into account those UV degrees of freedom. But on this particular point, I think it's crucial to stress that issue about the large field inflation in the not just a few, but of order 10 Planck units, has been addressed in specific canonical models. So I just want to stress that.
Sure, I mean, there's a lot of work about this. I mean, that's beyond question. Okay, good. So
Sorry, may I ask also, your alpha here also should have units, right?
No, this is an order one factor. It's the exponential rate in the
Delta
the
phi has
exponential. So I'm normalizing the field in Planck units. Yeah.
Okay.
So it's just some numerical factor.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, very good. So, so the questions, yeah, I wanted to explore in this talk, and the questions in which I've been working in the past year, because I think they are important in order to give an implication of this conjecture for phenomenology, is, okay, we have a lot of evidence already with extended supersymmetry, but what happens if we have less supersymmetry? What happens if we have a scalar potential? Because then we are not necessarily moving about along a geodesic trajectory, but the potential can make us move along a non-geodesic, and then what? Shall we also get the tower? What is the exponential rate in that case? Can we give any universal answer to this question? And also, what are these factors? No, I mean, try to be precise about what are these order one factors that appear in the conjecture. So this is, let's go to the first part, which I will dedicate most of my time. Depending on the time at the end, I will talk more or less about the order one factor. So let's see how it goes. Okay, so the main caveat, I mean, which probably some of you are already thinking, or the main caveat I always get when I give any of these talks about the distance conjecture, is what happens about non-geodesics. I mean, the distance conjecture is only restricting geodesic trajectories, so, but when constructing an inflationary model, we don't care about that. So one should notice that the distance conjecture is constrained in geodesics, but it's constrained in geodesics in pseudo-moduli spaces, in the sense that it also applies to moduli space, even if the scalars are not completely massless, but they are very light comparing to the cutoff. So the moduli space that we have could be the result from having some scalar potential and then integrating out all the heavy fields and restricting to an effective field theory only with the light ones. Which means that the distance conjecture also applies to the values of the potential. Okay, that's why it has some potential to constrain inflation.
All right, can I ask also? I think there's also a constraint that is asymptotic. So you should probably also define what you mean, like 100 Plancks or 10 Plancks. Where is
so
it?
right now I'm just discussing the distance conjecture in the sense that when you approach some infinite distance boundary, then you will be sensitive to this exponential behavior.
Right.
Now, how much it's related to the specific value of this exponential rate. If the exponential rate is very large and the tower is decaying very fast, then you will get sensitive to it earlier than if the exponential rate is bigger. So at the end of the talk is when I will be more precise about these order one factors.
Okay.
At the moment, it's just, I mean, when I say asymptotic, in the end, what we are doing is that we have a perturbative expansion. So you are in the boundary of the moduli space, and then you can, the effective field theory, you can understand that it's a perturbative expansion in some couplings, which are the inverse of the scalar fields. So as long as the perturbative expansion makes sense, in the sense that non-perturbative effects are subleading with respect to perturbative one and so on, then I am in the asymptotic region, and then the exponential behavior should be present. In the moment in which the perturbative expansion doesn't make sense anymore, then it's not the asymptotic region. So it's not about 100 or 1000. It's about perturbative expansion. I mean, whether perturbative expansion breaks down or not. Okay. So if we are in these asymptotic regimes, so the values of the potential should obey the distance conjecture, but this presents a puzzle because the moduli space, the notion of the moduli space and the geodesics changes at different energy scales in the presence of a potential, right? I can integrate out different heavy modes and get a different moduli space from the one I started with. And then geodesics in this moduli space at low energies might not be geodesics from the point of view of the moduli space at high energies. Okay, so for example, imagine that we have a moduli space before adding a potential, M, and then we add a potential and integrate all the heavy directions. So we only get a one-dimensional valley, which is our low energy moduli space. So this valley might not be a geodesic from the perspective of the original moduli space. And that could imply that, I mean, one could try to engineer potentials such that the distance conjecture is satisfied in the original moduli space, but not in the moduli space at low energies. And that would imply the distance conjecture is not a useful criterion at all, right? I mean, at what if it applies only at some energy regimes, at some in some effective field theories, how can we distinguish if we should apply it or not? So at which energy regime should we apply the distance conjecture? To the original one, to the low energy one, or what's going on? So the only way to make sense of this, as was also explained in the original paper, is that the distance conjecture actually should apply at any energy scale. So for any effective field theory that you have, valid at any intermediate energy scale should satisfy this conjecture, given that moduli space. And this implies that the distance conjecture gives rise to constraints on the potentials that are consistent with quantum gravity. So not every potential is valid because not every trajectory could behave as a geodesic from the infrared point of view. And this is one of the main messages, okay? That is not only about constraining the field range, it's about constraining the type of potential that we can get from string theory. In particular, in other words, the point is that it restricts the amount of non-geodesicity that is allowed for trajectories along valleys of the potential. And I think these constraints on the potential can have more implications and be more useful for phenomenology than the restriction of the field range alone. Okay, so let me try to be more quantitative on this, okay, and explain how this works. So for this, I will start with an example. I'm going to consider some hyperbolic modular space in which we have some axion phi and some suction s. And we are going to have, as usual, as I will show you it happens in typical string theory compactification, some towers of states that depend on the suctions, so the non-periodic scalars. And in this modular space, the geodesics are succionic trajectories, okay? So I only move along the S, along the scalar field S. So if we have some tower of this type, which could be a Keiki tower or string modes or other thing, the distance conjecture is satisfied because when written in terms of the proper field distance, so in terms of the canonically normalized scalar field, the mass of the tower behaves exponential in terms of the proper field distance delta. Okay, and here the alpha, I mean the exponential rate, is just given by the scalar curvature. Okay, now let's add a potential here. So we can add a potential and consider different trajectories, not just succionic ones. So we can consider, for example, some trajectory which is also moving along some axionic direction, so that the field distance is written this way. And then there are three types of trajectories depending on the behavior of this function. So if the derivative of this function goes to 0 asymptotically, this trajectory is going to behave as a geodesic eventually, and the distance conjecture is going to be satisfied, okay, with an exponential rate that asymptotically is just the same than the geodesic one. If this derivative is constant, so we are moving the same amount in the axion and the suction, this we will call it a critical trajectory because still the mass of the tower will behave exponentially, but the exponential rate changes, okay, and decreases depending on how big is this beta. And then we have the third option, which is that we are moving more in the axion than the suction. And we are going to call it a swampy trajectory in the sense that there is no exponential, there is no tower that decays exponentially here. There is no exponential decay anymore. So this type of trajectory should not be allowed as valleys of the potential according to the distance conjecture. Okay, more generally, the exponential rate of the tower is just the projection of the gradient of the log of the mass over the tangent vector. Okay, this is the exponential rate. And we can have a formulation of the distance conjecture by geometric means by defining the subspace spanned by all the tangent vectors of these asymptotically geodesic trajectories and the subspace spanned by the gradient vectors of log m of all the towers. And then the distance conjecture is telling us that for any vector in G, there must be at least one non-orthogonal vector in M. So a suitable tower of states becoming massless. Now, written this way, this is very similar to a completeness hypothesis. So the completeness hypothesis is also some Swampland statements that tells you that for every charge, in your gauge charge lattice, you should have some charge state. No, it should be populated by some state. So here is something similar. Like for every vector in this sort of scalar charge lattice, we should have some tower. Now, we would expect that this alpha, even if I'm not constraining what is the value that should have, it cannot get parametrically small because then at some point it's going to spoil the exponential behavior, right? So when we say that we have an exponential behavior, it's sort of implying that there is a lower bound for this exponential rate. And actually in the literature, it has already been proposed several bounds for this exponential rate. Well, some of them we have proven in Calabi-Yau manifolds, but others are proposals using the TCC and also relation with the weak gravity conjecture, as I will explain at the end of the talk. And if we take this stronger version of the distance conjecture, so if we assume that there is a lower bound on this exponential rate, then what we get is actually a statement which is very similar to the weak gravity conjecture. So now we are imposing that the rate has to be bigger than alpha 0. And this is similar to the weak gravity, which says that the charge to mass ratio has to be bigger than a given extremal, that the charge to mass ratio of an extremal black hole. So I'm going to make this analogy much more precise, okay, to show how similar the distance conjecture and the weak gravity conjecture are. But maybe let me, before, just have one slide to remind you why we are doing this. So the goal of what I'm explaining now is try to understand along which trajectories the distance conjecture would be satisfied for a given set of towers, right? So you have some set of towers, what trajectories would behave as geodesics, as values of the potential at low energies, and therefore what potentials, try to understand what potentials are allowed. So the point is that whenever we have a tower, as you can see here, right, whenever we have a tower, the distance conjecture is going to be satisfied along many trajectories, not only the geodesic ones, as long as they are non-orthogonal. And if we require some lower bound for the exponential rate, then the point is that the distance conjecture is satisfied along a cone determined by the alpha 0. So if we have different towers, what we are going to have is different cones where the trajectories along which the distance conjecture is satisfied. And if the cones don't span the full space, then there will be some trajectories which are swampy in the sense that they cannot behave as values of the potential, no, as geodesics. So this statement that we have different cones and how they overlap or not overlap is actually what can be translated to a convex Hall condition in the same way that we do for the weak gravity conjecture when we have more than one gauge field. So let me explain this analogy in detail. So we can define some scalar charge to mass ratio, which is given by the gradient of log m. So this is the derivative of the mass over the mass with the square of the field metric. Okay, and this is very similar to the weak gravity conjecture because, well, in the weak gravity conjecture we have a charge to mass ratio. Here we're going to have a scalar charge over mass ratio, and this is a scalar charge because if the tower has a mass which is parameterized by some scalar field, we can always span around the background, and this induces some Yukawa scalar force in which the charge under this force is the derivative of the mass. So what I'm writing here is not something random, it's really the ratio between the scalar charge and the mass of that tower. And written this way, then the exponential rate of the tower is just the Cartesian product of this scalar charge to mass ratio times the unitary vector of my trajectory. So if we define this space G as the space of all possible scalar charge directions, then the distance conjecture is just the statement that for every charge direction, there must be a charge infinite tower of states satisfying that alpha is bigger than this lower bound. And in analogy to the weak gravity conjecture, then we can call or denote this lower bound, I mean the states that has the exponential rate as small as possible, as the extremal states. No? So since this equation is a hyperplane from the origin with a distance alpha 0, when we span over different unitary vectors, what we are doing is to span a ball, like a unit ball, well, not a ball of radius alpha 0, and this is going to be our extremal region. So the extremal states are those that have exponential rate alpha 0, and they form this, they lie below, inside this extremal ball. So the statement of the distance conjecture generalized to all the trajectories is equivalent to a convex Hall statement as with the gravity conjecture, in the sense that the distance conjecture is satisfied if the convex Hall of all these scalar charge to mass ratio vectors contains this extremal region that is parameterized by the lower bound of the distance conjecture. And this is interesting because it is very similar now to the scalar with gravity conjecture that was formulated by Eran Parti, in which he was playing the same way that with the gravity conjecture, but with the scalar forces. And the only difference and the only thing that is not clear is that here in the scalar with gravity conjecture, these extremal states are defined as having no force, as feeling no force, while here is not clear yet how to, what is defined in this lower bound for the exponential rate of the distance conjecture. But I think that precisely trying to making this analogy more precise and understanding this lower bound, we could try to understand what is the bottom-up explanation, or having some bottom-up rationale for the distance conjecture. Like in general, why should it be true, no? Regardless of string theory, if we understand what is the minimum value that could ever get. Okay, so this is it for the convex Hall condition. Just to mention that then we can use it in two ways. So we could use it as predicting, so in order to satisfy the distance conjecture, we need to have as many towers as required to satisfy the convex Hall condition, as we do with the good gravity conjecture. But then we can also use it as constraining the possible trajectories along which the distance conjecture is satisfied. So the trajectories along which the convex Hall condition is not satisfied then cannot behave as geodesics, and therefore there shouldn't be any scalar potential whose value is along one of these trajectories. Okay, how much time do I have? Maybe 5 minutes?
It was nothing. Yes.
Nothing? Okay, so maybe I'm gonna just.
So you can wrap it up in 2 or 3 minutes. That would be nice.
Yeah.
Well, 5 minutes should be fine.
I can do that.
Thank
yes. So let me skip. This was just to the same example that I explained before of the hyperbolic plane, how to use the convex Hall condition to determine the same result. So just to mention that we can determine what is the maximum level of non-geodesicity allowed in these hyperbolic planes. So there is a maximum level associated to this alpha 0, and distinguish what are the swampy trajectories and the allowed trajectories. So let me just to go quickly, say, okay, this is all I explained so far is from a bottom-up perspective, like try to explain consistency, try to understand what consistency of the distance conjecture at any energy scale implies. But you could say, okay, have you checked this? I mean, like you have string theory. I mean, I work in string theory, so we can take string theory compactifications and check if this is happening, if the scalar potentials satisfy that the values of the potential are consistent with the distance conjecture or not. And we have done analysis in the context of Calabi-Yau compactifications. So in this case, we can be very precise. And well, first, we can prove that the asymptotic behavior of the metric behaves as these hyperbolic modular spaces. So that's why I was taking this as an example. And also, we have proven that there is an asymptotic behavior that is universal for all these flux scalar potentials when we go to the boundaries of the modular space. And this asymptotic behavior implies that the values of the potential are precisely these critical paths that I was talking about. So it seems that the flux potential that we get from string theory give rise to the maximum level of non-geodesity that the distance conjecture would allow. So it's like precisely the limit. And this confirms some backreaction issues that were studied before. Of course, this study is only in Calabi-Yau compactification so far, so it would be very interesting to understand it better in other compactifications and also go beyond parametric control. So at the moment, I'm talking about the leading term, right? When we take this perturbative expansion and we go to the boundary of the modular space, but we can continue keeping terms and see how the story changes. And it's something similar to ADCFT in the sense that we have information about the boundary, and now we are sort of doing bulk reconstruction. So I'm sure there are many questions about what happens beyond these asymptotic regions, and I would love to have a definite answer for that, but I prefer to go slowly and make like rigorous studies going step by step and adding the terms little by little. And so far, keeping the leading term, the result is that the distance conjecture is satisfied also for the values of the potential. Okay, so I think I have no more time. So I'm going to finish with this slide, which is sharpening order one factor. So we have many examples in string theory, which we can give precise bounds, but there is something interesting that I'm extrapolating from all these examples, which is that it seems that there is always some P4 gauge field that becomes weakly coupled asymptotically when the field range becomes large. So that there is always some gauge coupling that goes to 0. And that brings a very interesting relation between the weak gravity conjecture, the distance conjecture, and the absence of global symmetries, because then the same tower that satisfies the distance conjecture is also satisfying the weak gravity conjecture, and they act as a quantum gravity obstruction to restore a global symmetry that would emerge at infinite distance. And whenever this happens, then the exponential rate of the tower is fixed by the black hole extremality bound in the same way that for the weak gravity conjecture. So whenever we have some gauge coupling that goes to 0, we actually have bounds for the distance conjecture, given in terms of the extremality bound, and that in the end implies an order 1 factor for the exponential rate, and that we can compute using just EFT data. So this is something we have to study more in detail. I have some example about strings, but I think I'm gonna skip it. And let me go to the summary. So consistency of the distance conjecture at any energy scale implies constraints on non-geodesic trajectories and therefore constraints on the scalar potentials, which I think we have to study in more detail. We can formulate the distance conjecture as a convex Hall condition in analogy to the weak gravity conjecture, which suggests that all these conjectures, and the more I study this, I realize that there might be a much more efficient way to describe all these conjectures, maybe just with one statement that unifies everything, because they look more and more alike. I find this very interesting. And then, well, we have some analysis in the context of Calabi-Yau flux string compactifications, which suggests that the flux potentials asymptotically allow for the maximum level of non-geodesity that would be consistent with the distance conjecture. This shape of the potentials could have implications for what inflationary models we can construct. And finally, the exponential rate of the tower is actually bounded by the black hole extremality bound whenever there is a gauge coupling that vanishes exponentially. And this gauge coupling could be associated just to a 2-4 gauge coupling that is dual to an axion. So maybe I'm just talking about an axion, about having a string that becomes tensionless at infinite distance. So there are many things here. When I was talking about the cosmological signatures, I also had in mind what are the cosmological signatures of having, for example, always these cosmic strings. So let me finish here. Thank you very much for your attention and ask if there is any further question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Irene. So, a very nice talk. I can see people raising their hands. I saw Robert van den Berger writing something in the chat several minutes ago. Maybe Robert, can you say that in words?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, so the question is, your considerations, do they tell us anything about the de Sitter conjecture?
At the moment, no. So let me see. So I was not imposing anything about the scalar potential now, just studying the behavior of the presence of the infinite towers. Of course, what happens here, as I said, is that the distance conjecture itself is already constraining the scalar potentials. And what typically happens is that there is this runaway behavior asymptotically. So whenever the towers becomes really important, it seems that there is always this runaway of the scalar potential, which is related to not having a de Sitter vacuum at parametric control. So all I can say right now is about the absence of the de Sitter vacuum at parametric control. But that's it's not enough to say anything beyond this parametric control region. But it would be very interesting to check if, like, when I'm talking about these constraints, I would like to formulate in more generality the constraints on the scalar potential just coming from the distance conjecture, and then compare it exactly with the proposal about the gradient of the potential of Kuhn-Rune et al., or see what we get, if it has something, if it's something similar or not. A priori, they are different.
I have several more questions. So let me see, Evangelos Sfakianakis.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thanks for the great talk, Irene. So just a quick question. So you, in order to get non-geodesic trajectories, you sort of integrated out some heavy modes, and you ended up with potential that does not follow the geodesic of the field space. Is that so? In order for your analysis to hold, do the trajectories have to follow the value of the potential, or can they be the sort of hyperinflation, more complicated, like centrifugal supported trajectories?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the idea is that, it should apply for the modular space of any effective field theory. So if you are able, if you integrate out the heavy modes up to some cutoff scale and then consider the effective field theory below that, then if they are, you should think of the modular space as the space of the lightest fields, right? So there is a moment in which it's sort of a continuum, right? It's not
right.
Like, of course, if they are very light, it's obvious that they are like massless for you, so the distance conjecture should apply. And in the middle, if they are very close to the cutoff, it's not so clear how it makes sense, to make sense.
I see. Okay, right? So there's a weird.
So I think there is in the end, based on physical grounds, physics is a continuous, right? Like, it's not about here it applies and here it doesn't apply. So it's, there should be a way to understand it in a continuous way. But at the moment, I don't have a super clear picture about it. Okay. But in principle, it should apply to any effective field theory at any intermediate energy scale and consider what is the pseudo-modular space that you get.
Okay, fantastic, thanks.
Okay, Eugene Lim?
Hi. Hi, thanks for the very nice talk. I just have a kind of general questions from somebody who doesn't know a lot about this. Is there any statement either from the SDC or any other of the conjectures that make a restriction on variation of field in the spatial slicing instead of in terms of trajectories?
You mean like having some dependence on the space? Like,
yeah, exactly. Say the scalar field here and the scalar field in the moon cannot be too different.
Yes, yes. Yeah, so this is sometimes what is called a local Swampland distance conjecture. There are a few works about it. It seems that also when you try to engineer some large field range with a spatial dependence, also something goes wrong. It's not necessarily that it's an infinite tower of states, But like, for example, I don't know, like when we have these strings, I mean, one way we have a cosmic string, which is weakly coupled, the back reaction of the string drives the scalars to infinite distance at the core of the string. So also something goes wrong in the sense that if the tension of the string is going to go to 0, so the EFT is also going to break down because of the presence of these strings. So that's an example in which the same type of physics happens. There are also examples that what happens is that, for example, when you have a bubble of nothing, you can also engineer a large scalar variation towards the wall of the bubble. But then, of course, something bad happens because then you have an instability and you get, I mean, you get to the wall of nothing inside. So at the moment, I mean, it seems that also it's not possible to engineer parametrically large scalar variation with a spatial dependence. Something goes wrong. And it might have also a correlation to the infinite tower that becomes light when you try to move in moduli space. But maybe that could bring, in fact, some reason for the distance conjecture. I mean, if we understand what goes wrong in space-time, maybe we understand why it cannot be engineered either in moduli space.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my thinking in terms of like simple GR people, which is, like what we do is that, if I cannot have a homogeneous trajectory that traverse the Planck scale, for example,
Yes.
I can always take that space-time that is, illegal and then choose some hyperslicing that is not homogeneous, but cut through different value of the scalar that is over the Planck scale, for example. So, I mean, I guess I'm just trying to figure out whether or not that is still applicable to what the conjecture is.
Yeah. There's a work of Nicolis saying that you would engineer some black hole before being able to prove such a distance, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah, the Nicolis paper, right? Okay, thanks a lot.
Okay, Marco Stolisi?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I still have the background when I had the, sorry, we had like the Christmas party. Yeah, okay, it's okay, it fits. So Irene, I wanted to ask you, so in the last period, in the last year, there have been like many wars, especially from the cosmology community, trying to point out that that following like non-geodetic trajectory, you can evade somehow like Swan Planck distance conjecture, right? So, and you can travel the super Planck distance. Perfect. So it seems to me that now the perspective you propose is that you say, well, there are like scalar potential that force your field to follow non-geodetic trajectory, and if the trajectory is is not non-geodesic, is not enough non-geodesic, you don't find anymore the tower of masses that decay exponentially, and so this is not consistent with quantum gravity. This kind of scalar potential is correct. This kind of interpretation.
Yeah. So the idea is that, I mean, in the end, yes, not every scalar potential, right, could also arise from string theory or be consistent with quantum gravity. From an IFT perspective, if you have some scalar potential, you have just some toy model, some EFT, and you put some scalar potential such that the value of this potential gives rise to some trajectory which has a parametrically large, which allows you to move parametrically far away, and there is no infinite tower of states that becomes light or anything like that, then that scalar potential should not be allowed from quantum gravity. So that's
right. But this was the point of this work, right? So like, I mean, like the point of this work were like, if you don't follow like a geodesic trajectory, you're able to evade the
But the thing is that the value of the potential is like a geodesic trajectory from the infrared point of view. So that's the point. Like the notion of what is geodesic or not geodesic changes when we are at different energy regimes. So when we say it's only about geodesics, it's not only geodesics before adding the potential, like the original moduli space, but also after adding the potential, if we just have some value, this value is a one-dimensional moduli space, and then the trajectory is a geodesic there.
That's totally fine. Yeah.
Okay. You mean like non-geodesics within this infrared model
I mean
space?
exactly the way
Okay.
you and your collaborator mean non-geodesic and
Okay.
geodesic, right?
Okay.
So I'm just saying that
We're running out of time, so maybe Enrico,
Okay,
the
sorry.
last question.
Sorry.
Sorry. Because Enrico, do you have the last question?
Yes, yeah. Well, I've been confused about this in the past, and I was still confused. It's about the definition of delta phi when you talk about non-geodesics. It seems maybe there was an equation missing. Delta phi equals, I could assume that it is the integral in d phi between some initial condition and some final condition. Is that correct?
So delta phi is going to be always a geodesic at some energy regime. The point is that that trajectory might not lead to a geodesic from a high, from the original moduli space. But there is always some energy regime in which it is a geodesic. So it's just the field distance of the geodesic.
I don't understand maybe even what you mean by that. By geodesic, you mean that I define a metric?
So the shortest distance between the 2 points. So I have a metric and I compute the integral, right? Of the.
This has no notion about potential because only the metric appears in this definition.
Yes, yes. It's only, yeah, exactly. It's only the metric.
The potential.
So the potential is, the thing is that when you add a potential, if I now integrate out the heavy fields and focus only on the light field that remains, then I have a new moduli space given by this light field, and then I have to compute geodesics in that new moduli space. So the potential plays a role on telling you what is the moduli space that you get in the infrared.
No, but
once you have it, you just compute it with a metric.
But suppose you don't have a moduli space, you just keep the potential. The moduli space means that it is exactly flat.
No, that's what I mean. So when I say moduli space, it's actually like pseudo moduli space. So what matters is not that it's exactly flat, but that it's light comparing to the cutoff.
So if it is not exactly flat, how does that change your notion of what the delta phi is? How does V appears in the definition of delta phi?
So the idea here is that from the perspective of high energies, right, there is a moment in which the effect of this nearly flat, of this potential, is negligible, and the distance is just like if you compute the distance as if it is exactly flat. So since this is sort of an asymptotic statement, usually we just consider the metric because it's like you put yourself at a very high energy scale, and then you see this light field as approximately massless and compute the distance just with the field metric.
Okay, I think we have to stop here because we're running too much out of time. And then there will be the next section in 20 minutes or 18 minutes at 5 p.m. So let's take a break. So we
can continue by Slack as well, no?
We can continue by Slack. Yes, that's perfect. Yes, because I have a question that I didn't have the chance to ask. So, very good. Okay, let's say, well, thank Irene again. It was a very nice talk. And so we'll reconvene in, say, 18 minutes.